Felipe Jaramillo to make his welcoming remarks, but to also frame the discussion we are going to have here. Over to you, Felipe.
Thank you, Vera, and good morning. All doing things very differently, and we appreciate that you are finding the time to join us virtually during this Kenya Economic Update launch today of our 21st edition. On behalf of the World Bank, let me welcome you and let me open the session by making 3 points. So first, I want to express gratitude to all those who work in the health sector, all the frontline service providers here in Kenya. We know that they are working very hard and courageously to keep us safe and to contain the spread of the pandemic in Kenya. Second, this pandemic threatens both lives on the one hand and livelihoods on the other. As of early this week, the spread of this coronavirus disease across the world has had a huge toll, as I'm sure you all have read, with more than 3 million infections and over 200,000 deaths. The spread of this virus has also caused unprecedented supply and demand shocks in the working of economies around the world. This has led to a major contraction of global economic activity, and this has been very unexpected and is having a major impact on the lives of Africans and the economies here in Africa. The Africa region is poised now to face its first recession in 25 years. For the region as a whole, the World Bank has downgraded our economic growth projections. Earlier, we were expecting the Africa region to grow by 3.1% this year. And our latest projections suggest that at best, the African economy will shrink by 2.1% and up to 5.1%. We have a high range and a low range, but in both cases, it's a contraction for 2020, which we haven't seen in many years. In other words, the regional economy in Africa, along with the economy of the rest of the world, will contract significantly in 2020. We are very concerned at the World Bank of what this means for the people of Africa. It is very possible that poverty will rise this year and that many will face unexpected hardships. And Kenya here will not escape these impacts. This Kenya Economic Update that we launched today provides a detailed account of recent economic developments and our sense of the outlook, despite continued uncertainties about how deep and about how long this crisis will be. And the update also discusses some policy options to help confront the crisis. And my third and last point, I wanted to commend the efforts of policymakers in Kenya to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 by stepping up spending on the health sector to strengthen capacity, and by also putting in place health policy containment measures to flatten the epidemic curve over the short run. Beyond this, measures to channel cash to support hard-hit households we believe are critical, given the scale of the economic shock and the fact that vulnerable families are those that have less ability and resources to cope. In addition, we also welcome efforts to help struggling firms, especially micro, small, and medium enterprises, so that they can survive through the worst of the crisis and preserve jobs. We know the Kenyan government faces a difficult task in the face of the huge uncertainties to minimize the loss of life and livelihoods in the face of the virus. Social distancing and other containment measures have helped delay the spread of COVID-19, preventing unnecessary loss of life, and gaining some precious time to strengthen and prepare the healthcare system so it can better cope. Following the prescribed health containment guidelines would make a huge difference and save many lives. So let me end by saying that the World Bank remains committed to the Kenyan people, and we will continue to support the government and the citizens by providing technical and financial support to help efforts to combat the impacts of the coronavirus pandemic and to aid in the recovery efforts after the crisis to sustain inclusive growth and reduce poverty. Asante, over to you.
Thank you very much, Felipe. Much appreciated. And I think the crux of the matter for most Kenyans is how can we make sure that the most vulnerable amongst us are cushioned? And I think that is the crux of the discussion here today. And in addition to households, how do we protect those small and medium enterprises? So thank you very much, Felipe. Now, food security in Kenya is facing a twin shock from restrictions in place due to COVID-19 crisis and the earlier locust invasion, contributing to a spike in food prices. Peter Chacha is a senior economist with the World Bank Group and the main author of this report. He will be walking us through the macroeconomic aspects of the report, and joining him is another senior economist with the World Bank, Alex Sinyat, and Alex will be talking us through the policy options as outlined in the report. So over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Vera, and good morning to you all who are watching and connected to this very unique and special connection to the launch of the Kenya Economic Update Edition 21. Now, we are aware that there are many questions in the minds of many Kenyans regarding how the pandemic is impacting on some of the things that they do care most about. For example, job security, adjustment to wages and their salaries, access to meals or food. I've actually heard somebody worried about access to data bundles and more generally on the economy. Now, if there is any silver lining behind all these things, it's that we are all together in this. And there's a saying that goes that, a problem that's shared, it's a problem that's halved. Now, over 210 countries and territories are affected equally, and COVID-19 is threatening both their livelihood but also lives, and is generating a lot of uncertainty to their growth. Now, this particular edition of Kenya Economic Update, we will be looking at three main points. First, we will be looking at how the pandemic is affecting negatively on the Kenyan economy and straining its public finances. Now, this is I'm told my mic is not on. Okay, so the report has three main messages. First, the pandemic will have a large negative impact on the Kenyan economy and its public finances. And secondly, stepping up spending to strengthen the health system's capacity to cope with a potential spike in infections and expand the testing capacity remains a top priority. This is important so that the healthcare system is able to care for those infected, but at the same time to be able to understand the characteristics of the infections so that it should go toward the strategy to mobilize and restart the economy again. And third, observing and following the public health guidance on social distancing and the containment measures is critical. And this is because it will help in delaying the spread of the epidemic and in a way allow the health system to be able to cope and eventually enable the economy to reopen and restart. At the same time, these social containment measures do have huge economic costs, and so measures to protect the most vulnerable households and to support small businesses are necessary, given the magnitude of the economic shock. So these are the main messages in the report. We'll go into details to discuss the first part, how we see the channels of impact and the emerging economic policy challenges. And then I will invite my colleague Alex to present some of the potential policy options to confront the crisis. So real GDP growth projection globally is highly uncertain. But what is consensus amongst all forecasters is that there's a major recession in 2020 for the regional and the global economy. So when we look at this chart which I'm sharing on the screen, the global economy is expected to contract by about 3%. Sub-Saharan Africa region is going to contract by about 2.1%. The ESC region, which has been known to grow very, very strongly, is also going to contract to grow at a substantially low figure of about 2.9%. Now, this is just an indication that the entire global economy is in a great lockdown, and with this, it's going to result into slowdown in economic activities and result into great recession. Okay? But more importantly, this slowdown has huge negative spillover effect to the Kenyan economy. And I will explain in details in the next slide. So the economic activity in Kenya is being weighed down by a combination of both supply and demand shocks from the external, but also from the domestic economy. Okay, so on the external side, the global supply chains are being disrupted. And here, as you may be aware, most of our industries requires intermediate inputs to be able to produce goods that they eventually sell to our households or to final consumers in Kenya. Now, a good example is your border. If you ride the border, most of the equipment that are used to put together that motorbike are usually imported as completely knocked down kits, and mostly they come from China. Now, because of partial shutdown in those source markets, the supply of these imports they cause delays, and sometimes they could lead to higher costs, and this will lead to an increase in the cost of your border bike. This is just an indication of one of the disruption channels that the economy will suffer. But there are many other intermediate inputs. For example, the clinker that makes a bag of your cement and so on. And all this will be disrupted through partial shutdown in the source countries where intermediate are being obtained from. On the demand side, we are aware that the global economy is slowing down, and so the demand for exports are also going to be affected significantly. As you may be aware, for example, the EU accounts for about 70% of all cut flowers are from Kenya. And they're also pursuing policies of social distancing and partial closure of those economies. And so events, particularly weddings, parties, are all slowed down because of the requirements to reduce large gatherings. And those are events that really are essential for the demand of flowers. And similarly, there will be reduced tourism earnings following, of course, the slowdown in the economy, but also travel advisories to contain the spread of COVID-19. And also, because of job losses, especially where Kenyans are working with the diaspora, remittance inflows are going to slow down substantially. So these are the channels which we observe directly from the external side of the economy. On the domestic side, on the other hand, the measures which have been adopted to contain the spread of COVID-19, which are needed and necessary to enable the health system to be able to cope with the potential spike in the cases of infections, will also reduce movement of people, will reduce interaction, social interaction, and will reduce, generally reduce demand and consumption, and that will lead to reduced aggregate demand in general. Firms, on the other hand, worry of investing until the crisis clears. But also, more importantly, some of the firms are actually facing cash flow challenges. So those combined, they're going to see a reduction in private sector investment substantially in 2020. So taking all this into account, and also aware that the Kenyan economy is actually entering this crisis with some considerable level of resilience. Growth has been very strong at about 5.6% in the last 5 years. We've had macroeconomic stability, inflation has been within target, and there was a huge commitment from the government to consolidate, fiscal consolidation, and to ensure that they rein on its debt level. Nonetheless, this is a crisis like no other. It's being described by pundits as a perfect storm. And so it's going to negatively impact on the growth of the Kenyan economy. Now, we have taken into account the disruptions of economic activities and into our projections. We are looking at if the disruption of economic activity lasts for about 2 months, starting mid-March to mid-May, and assuming that by then the COVID infection will have peaked in Kenya, then our projection for growth is about 1.5% for 2020. And this is also expected to have a quick recovery to 5.2% in 2021. Nonetheless, because of high uncertainty and the fact that COVID-19 spread may not be contained until probably the second half of 2020. And so the containment measures will need to be put in place for longer, and by extension, economic activities will fall even further. And so for the first time, we do present an adverse scenario, or we can call a downside scenario, of a contraction of -1% for 2020. In both these cases, we expect a fairly quick recovery for 2021, and we also assume that there will be normal weather, which will support the growth and production in agricultural sector. We also assume that the second phase or the second round of locust invasion will be contained and will not be able to harm the agricultural production particularly in the mid-year. So those are the main assumptions we make, and the risk to this growth is deriving mainly from the extent and the impact of COVID infections and its impact on the economy, both domestic economy, but also the international economy. So while the value-added data is not yet available across many sectors, what we did was to look at what is happening particularly on the services and the manufacturing using what we call leading economic indicators. So Google has a very nice facility to be able to trace mobility changes, particularly responding to the social distancing measures. Using the data from Google, it shows that since the implementation of the social distancing measures, there's been a substantial reduction in retail and recreation activities in Kenya, and they have decreased by about 45%. There has also been a reduction in transit stations, people going to public service vehicles station to catch transport. That has also reduced by about 39%. Going to buy groceries and pharmaceutical products, that has reduced by about 33%. Going to workplaces, that has reduced by about 22%. Going to national parks, that has also been affected. What has gained is that people are staying more at their residences. So this is just a snap indicator that the social distancing measures are indeed in effect and working. But more importantly, they show the reduction in consumption, for example, because as you move from one point to another, you are able to consume and be able to contribute to economic activities, or you're able to go to restaurants such as Java and grab a cup of coffee with a friend. These are the activities which are being hit the most, so accommodation, hospitality, restaurants, travel, transportation sector. These are the sectors that are likely to be hit very significantly. But also in the manufacturing sector, the Purchasing Managers Index does indicate how they perceive the economy, and whenever it's falling below the 50-point mark, that's an indicator of negative business sentiment, reduced orders, and it shows that the sector is generally going to perform poorly in the context of this crisis. Now, turning to the public finances, the pandemic is exerting a lot of strain on the management of public finances. And we saw that the government responded positively by putting in place a fiscal policy response that is going to help, particularly strengthen the health sector's capacity to be able to handle or respond to potential infections. And so by strengthening the capacity, by expanding infrastructure, acquiring additional beds, and ventilating ventilators or respiratory support machines. These are great, but they are going to add pressure into expenditures. They also did expand expenditure towards supporting farms, for example, by expediting refunds of VAT, ensuring that pending bills are cleared. All this from the expenditure side will be pressure from the expenditure side, which will expand deficit. But also, they also put in place tax cut measures, which are going to help farms have liquidity to be able to survive through the crisis, and also protect households by giving additional income to households. Now, all these measures collectively, they lead to an expansion in fiscal deficit of about 1.6%. And so in total, the deficit has expanded from about 6.3% of GDP pre-COVID to about 7.8 to 8% of GDP due to the new measures. And all these measures all these additional expenditure increase or additional deficit increment is going to be funded through domestic borrowing. And so debt is going to increase slightly to about 63.2%. Now, turning to the macro environment, inflation generally remains contained within its target, although food inflation has started to increase. And this is stemming from a bad year of harvest in 2019, but also due to food supply chain disruptions due to the containment measures. Now, we are aware that food tracking is exempted from the containment measures. However, the environment is still not as conducive for tracking, and so it could be leading to adding a little bit to price in terms of the additional frictions. And so with low inflation and a negative outlook gap, the Monetary Policy Committee has been very supportive to the economy and has lowered the central bank rate for the 3 consecutive meetings. We expect additional monetary stimulus, particularly post-COVID, to be able to support recovery of economic activities. Lastly, on the external accounts, we are seeing some pressure, particularly because of the fact that the access to the international market is effectively shut, not only to Kenya, but to many other economies until after the crisis. And so, though we have a narrowing current account deficit because of largely the reduction in imports, which outweighs the decline in exports, the financing of this particular deficit is going to be a bit challenging, particularly due to lack of access. Due to lack of access to international financial markets. Now, having gone through all the channels that the economy is being impacted by COVID-19, I'd like to invite my colleague Alex to take us through some of the potential policy responses to confront this crisis. Alex, please.
Thank you very much, Peter, and good morning to everyone joining us from my side. Just while I go ahead and share my screen, I'd like to reassure I do have my mask. I've just taken it off while I present, while I speak. So moving from the economic situation at the moment to the policies that we put forward as ideas for consideration in this report. Really, the framing of this is that government is navigating a very difficult situation as it finds this balance between minimizing the need to minimize the loss of life on the one hand, and on the other hand, do as much as possible to reduce the impact on livelihoods, which is also obviously a key problem. And it's navigating this difficult task in the context of an enormous amount of uncertainty. And it's an uncertainty that, as Peter mentioned with his problem shared comment, is something that all governments all around the world are facing. So our general framing of the kind of policy context is that, on the one hand, we have social distancing and other containment measures that have been taken, that have been implemented quite decisively here in Kenya, and have done a lot, are doing a lot to delay the spread of COVID-19, preventing the loss of life, preventing more people from becoming sick, and ultimately preventing the healthcare system from being overwhelmed by this, providing more time to strengthen that system. So we've seen that decisive action so far in Kenya. Unfortunately, on the other side, these containment measures in Kenya, as elsewhere, are very costly to the economy, costly to incomes, costly to jobs, ultimately costly to livelihoods because of their very disruptive impact to social interaction, to production, and to demand. So faced with this situation, the way we would characterize it is that government is going to need to continue to calibrate its response across the whole spectrum of containment options. And we see different governments in different countries pursuing different strategies, and those strategies depend, of course, on the situation in a particular country around the living arrangements that people have, the capacity of the healthcare system, the way in which the economy functions. All of these things have an impact on what the optimal strategy is. And in Kenya, after this initial decisive action that the government has taken around containment measures, we're starting to see that continued calibrating of the response. Just yesterday, for example, with the announcement of limited resumption of activity for restaurants. What can guide government during this difficult process? We think basically three key considerations. There's much more detail, of course, in the report, but what we want to take this opportunity to highlight is kind of three, we think, sort of guiding principles, if you like. The first one, and this has already been mentioned by our director and other speakers, is to maintain a strong focus throughout the process on supporting the most vulnerable households. And we think one of the key ways to do that is by considering more increases in cash transfers and support to the families that are least able to make it through this enormous shock. Talking about the size of the shock makes us think that, and this is the second key point, that more economic policy measures are probably called for to counter this huge shock to livelihoods. But we do need to recognize, as Peter outlined, that the public finances are already constrained going into this crisis. So we think that means that there should be a focus on measures which are timely, targeted, and temporary. And each of those is really important because, if measures are not timely enough, they're not going to begin to have an effect quickly enough to help people during this crisis, which is unfolding very rapidly. So it's crucial that they're timely. Measures need to be targeted because otherwise they're not going to help the people who really need it. And by and large, they probably need to be temporary because the reality is that many of the things that government will want to do to help vulnerable people get through this do carry high costs. And you wouldn't want to pursue measures that turn out to be unsustainable and have big negative consequences because they involve permanent costs. And the final sort of key guiding principle that we wanted to highlight is, as we're all aware, this is a really rapidly evolving situation with very high uncertainty. And in a situation like that, we think there are very high returns to investing as much as possible in data, so that the picture is as clear as possible to help guide the policymakers as they go through this. So examples include, in terms of health data, investing heavily on as much testing and different kinds of testing as possible, so that there's as clear a picture as we can get about what's really happening with COVID-19 in the country. And in terms of economic data, it's things like rapid surveys. We can do phone surveys, understand what households are experiencing, understand what small firms are experiencing. So those are the guiding principles that we're suggesting in the report for policy. And then the report goes into considerable detail on more specific policy ideas in each of a range of areas. This slide lays out the framework for considering these different policy options. You've basically got a range of instruments, from health instruments and social protection to monetary policy, fiscal policy, financial and regulatory policies, and you can bring those instruments to bear to achieve a number of targeted outcomes, and those can be characterized as there's a lot of talk at the moment about flattening the curve. There are different kinds of curves that you want to flatten in policy. The one is, we could call it the human suffering curve, flatten that with your social distancing, containment, and other health measures, flatten the bankruptcies curve, flatten the curve in terms of loss of income and livelihood, and then finally flatten the recession curve. Once it becomes time for the economy to begin to normalize after this, there are many things government can do to try and essentially stimulate and encourage a stronger recovery and sustainable recovery as possible. I don't think we have the time to go into much depth around the policy ideas. We would love for you to read that in the report. But just to give you very quickly, a couple of highlights on the cash transfers. Kenya is relatively fortunate in having some infrastructure where already cash is going to needy households, particularly elderly people, people with disabilities, orphans, and so on. So there's an initial infrastructure that could be built upon in terms of spreading coverage to more households that need help and potentially deepening the supports to households that are already receiving help. And then as the situation plays out, we think the reality is also that it may be that alternative ways of providing support to households could have a role. There are alternative ways of figuring out who in the population really does need support the most. I mentioned phone surveys, other kinds of existing data on where there's the most need in communities. And there are also different support mechanisms that could be considered. Government is already working with some of these. For example, the use of mobile money to get help to people quickly and in a way that's compatible with social distancing. And then the need to support especially small firms has already been mentioned. Targeted liquidity support for firms in hard-hit sectors could be considered. And then many measures in the financial sector may be relevant around de-risking, continued access to finance and credit guarantees. And perhaps government could also do things around supporting the operations of firms to be able to
Alex, just to chime in there, we're having a bit of a technical difficulty there. We will get back to the speakers as soon as we can. Over to you, Julian, said the studio.
Many thanks, Vera. That has been a very comprehensive
So, ladies and
comment.
gentlemen, we're coming live at you from the World Bank Kenya.
Vera, carry on.
Alex, over to you. We had a bit of a challenge there. Julians, can you take it over and we can pan back to the speakers, please? Thank you.
Absolutely. Just a quick recap of what has been mentioned right now, that it is important that the government continues to put in place measures to try and mitigate the effects of COVID-19. While it is important that the measures taken are targeted, are timely, and that indeed they are just temporary so as to ensure that the country maintains on its agenda of fiscal consolidation. We're trying to get back to Alex, who can at least wind up his remarks on the presentation, on the policy options, I should say, the country still has. And while at that, let's listen in. It seems we're getting back.
I ended the presentation on our side, and I was going to hand back to you for Q&A.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have the studio speaking at the moment. Julians, can you hear me? Okay, it looks like we've had a break in the live broadcast between us and Nation TV. Please bear with us as we sort that out.
Yes, Vera, you can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear. Over to you, Julians.
Thank you very much, Vera. We have been having key presentations on the World Bank Kenya Economic Update, highlighting the fact that responses taken by the government need to be targeted, timely, and indeed temporary, just to ensure that it still maintains its agenda of fiscal consolidation. And of course, that actually means that we are keeping our expenses in check, even as we do respond to this crisis. And there have been a number of questions coming in on the social media platform. If I could just begin by throwing it out there. Babito Auto Edition on Twitter is asking, with the government implementing fiscal and monetary measures in what seems to be a rush, how will we pay for the massive spending on our budget deficit and debt, considering our already challenging debt profile? So that's a question coming, and perhaps whether Peter or Alex can help us take a deep dive into that question. Vera?
Okay, thank you very much, Julian's there at NTV Studios. Alex and Peter, we have two questions there for you, and I just want to clarify that you got them loud and clear. Over to you, Peter.
Derek, could you repeat the questions for us, please?
Yes, if I could repeat the question. Babito Dishon is asking, with the government implementing fiscal and monetary measures, how will we pay for the massive spending on our budget deficit and the challenging debt profile we are already experiencing? Alex, you got me?
Okay. Well, thank you, Fabrizio, for that question. So it's important to underscore that this is a very, very huge exogenous shock to the economy, and most governments have responded in a way to be able to enable first the health system be able to cope with potential spike in infections, but also to quickly pivot towards supporting firms so that there are not going to be massive layoffs in terms of jobs, and also protect the most vulnerable household so that they're able to cope through this crisis. So all these measures requires additional spending, and the fiscal deficit has expanded. But this is understandable in the short run, during the crisis period, for the government to provide some stimulus or some way for the economy to be able to cope through the crisis. But certainly, post-crisis, most of this will be put in reverse. And so the fiscal consolidation pathway will restart again once the economy recovers. And that's the same situation also with the monetary stimulus. So typically, during a crisis, governments are supposed to spend proactively to support the recovery of the economy. And then once the economy recovers, it should reduce that particular spending to allow the private sector to be the main driver of growth. So I think that's how basically the argument in the report is actually placed in that way. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. I have 3 questions here for you coming in at us from Cisco WebEx. And the first one is from Daniel Omanyo. What sort of recovery does the World Bank expect for Kenya in 2021 and thereafter? Will that be a V-shaped or a U-shaped recovery? The presentation here today shows a V-shaped recovery. What could explain such a jump from 1.5% in 2020 to 5.2% in 2021, considering the various shocks the economy is experiencing? So that's our first question. And our second question here is, with the widening of the fiscal deficit due to effects of the measure to contain COVID, government is set to take up more debt. What are the implications of the post-crisis growth rates of debt on the economy, particularly on the growth recovery part? And the third question I have here is, on what grounds does the World Bank and IMF believe that the Kenyan and the East African community economy will bounce back to fairly decent figures in 2021? So maybe we can take that and we'll circle back with another set of questions if we have time. Please keep the responses short and crisp. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Interesting and interrelated questions. I mean, in terms of the shape of the recovery, it's correct that what we're currently projecting is what you could call a V-shape into 2021. But look, you know, what we have also emphasized in this presentation and certainly in the report is that the cone of uncertainty around that projection is really unusually wide. Everything clearly depends on how this pandemic continues to play out, both in terms of the global economy and the external factors for Kenya, and of course domestically. And there's inevitable uncertainty around that. We've been guided really by 2 things. The first is that the baseline view for the global economic dynamics, so far from our headquarters in Washington and across the streets at the IMF, is looking for more of a V-shaped rebound. In a way, there's been, you know, this very dramatic path downwards. It suggests that the potential is there for a snapback, depending on how things go with the virus, which is the huge uncertainty. So we've been guided a little bit by that. And then the other factor is that, you know, it is reasonable to expect that conditional on a normalization in containing the pandemic, you know, that Kenya has these fundamental engines of growth, and that you will get back to average growth rates along the line of what we've seen in recent years, which, let's not forget, is based quite solidly on agricultural output, for one thing, which is one of the sectors that we do expect to be relatively less affected by what's been happening. But we will continue to, you know, look at the data as it comes in, and as I say, as the pandemic plays out, and the reality is we'll need to adjust going forward as appropriate. On the implications of more debts, I mean, I think that was partially addressed by Peter's prior response, which is that, you know, so long as this is a short-term increase in debts, there's an inevitability to that. Even if the government didn't respond, the scale of the economic shock is such that revenues would inevitably decline and the deficit would increase. We do expect an increase in support to Kenya from development partners, the international financial institutions, ourselves, that can help to finance that. And Kenya's sources of debt are actually relatively well diversified. So we do think that it goes into this with some sources of resilience also in terms of financing the situation. But then, as the economy does normalize, that medium-term agenda of the importance of reducing this financing need so that there can be more resources available to the private sector to pick up and to drive growth continues to be really important. So we'll be focused on that as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alex. I do have a couple more questions here. This is from Alphonse Obiero, and he is asking, the projections are based on the assumption that this situation will last for 2 months. What happens when it goes beyond that? Does this invalidate the prognosis? Now, I know that we had given 2 scenarios, so maybe Alex, Peter, you can touch on that. And the next question is from Anthony Mbadi, and he says, what advice would the World Bank and IMF give to the Kenyan government, and as such the region, on remodeling their economies along south to south thinking, taking into consideration the impact we are feeling due to collapse in major exports to the West and losses in the tourism sector? And the third question here, what lessons should the government of Kenya take from this to drive the implementation and adoption of technology to spur development in the area of education and retail? Do we expect the government to allocate resources to ICT, especially to cover retail and education? And I know the report does touch on the use of mobile technology or digital technology. So over to you. We have a lot of questions coming in. I think we owe it to Kenyans to be able to respond to a few more questions. So we may have to extend the broadcast for another 15 minutes. Over to you, Peter and Alex. And for the next round, I'll come back to the studio and see if they have other questions. So over to you.
Well, thank you, Vera, and thank you for those very valuable questions. So on growth, we did actually indicate that there is a huge degree of uncertainty on growth projections globally. And so for Kenya, we did provide a baseline scenario of 1.5% in 2020, and on assumption that the containment measures would last, or if you can think about it, the reverse of it, disruption of activity will last for 2 months, from mid-March to mid-May. There, we assume that the economy will grow by 1.5%. Then we also provided an adverse scenario in the event that the COVID spread is not contained until the second half of the year. Then the containment measures will be required for longer, and this will result into even further fall in economic activities. And we do provide a projection which is a contraction in terms of growth by 1% in 2020. So those are the range of growth. So you can think of it from 1.5 to minus 1%. That range will be clarified as more data become available, particularly as when we reach the second half of the year. Thank you. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you. So just to very quickly pick up on the interesting question around ICT. Yes, I think that's one dimension where the world is going to be a bit different after this experience. And in Kenya, which already has notable innovations on mobile money and the use of digital platforms, I think it's reasonable to expect that to accelerate. And it could also play a a pretty key role in management of the crisis as it plays out, even in very short run, particularly mobile money.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex. We can hear some background noise there. I would like to ask you to mute, please, so we can have a seamless broadcast. Thank you very much. I will now hand over to Julian Samboko at the NTV studios. He has 2 questions for you. I will try to also take those questions and repeat them so that they are clear to the presenters. Over to you, Julian.
Many thanks, Vera. 2 very quick questions, which have come from various sources, so I'll lump them together. The first one is, what does the World Bank think about the request for debt rescheduling by Kenya, among other countries? And the second question is, we are hearing so much about COVID-19. What about the locust as a threat, the locust invasion, I should say, as a threat to Kenya's economic outlook? Over to you, Peter and Alex.
Okay. Thank you very much, Julian. Alex and Peter, would you like me to repeat those 2 questions?
No, thank you, Vera. We got that loud and clear. I'll take the first one on the debt. As people would be aware, it was agreed at the level of the G20 to have an initiative to support a suspension of debt payments, especially by low-income countries, IDA eligible countries for the more concessional part of World Bank lending. A suspension on servicing of official bilateral debt. That's an important starting point. For many countries, that can be a huge financial relief. It's something that could make a substantial difference in Kenya as well, should the government choose to go that route. But this is still something that's evolving very rapidly, because it's a complex area with different sorts of debt owing to different parties, and questions of finding the right balance and the right signals and making that really effective. So it's an interesting area, including for countries like Kenya, and something definitely to keep watching. On locusts, Peter?
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Vera, for the question on the locust, or the second phase of locust invasion, because Kenya already had a first round. The main assumption in the report is that there is already ongoing intervention to contain the spread of locust invasion, particularly as they come from the northern counties and towards the grain basket counties of the country. And so the main assumption we do make in the report is that since there's already intervention to fumigate and reduce the spread of this particular crisis, it's a risk on to our projection rather than a main assumption in terms of the growth projection that we have. So it's a risk. We treat it as a risk in the forecast. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. We have further questions coming in here from Cisco WebEx. What guidance can the bank give in regards to when the government of Kenya can exercise gradual reopening to enable the economy slowly come back to life? Second question is from Professor Nelson Wawira, and he asks, what informed the prediction of growth of 2% for the East African community? And the third question here is, how much does the government of Kenya pay to China in debt servicing, and is a default to them and on the Eurobonds a possibility? So I'll let you take those 3 questions, and if we have time, we can take another round of questions. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. We can make a start. So on the specific advice around the reopening process, I mean, as we emphasized in the presentation, there's a variety of approaches that can be taken to this. It'll depend on how things continue to develop, and the government will weigh the different factors and have a strategy accordingly. The point that we would really emphasize is just how useful it is to maximize the data that you can have to inform that process. So hence the emphasis on testing on the health side, but also the need to ramp up as much as possible on high frequency kind of economic data and data on who is most at risk and is struggling the most in terms of the impact on livelihoods. So it's an uncertain and a rapidly evolving situation. I'm sure that the government will be informed by the best evidence that it can get on the health side, as well as on the economic side. And you can see the wide range of approaches that countries are adopting, and that reflects the levels of uncertainty and the different country situations. Peter wants to come in on the others.
So on the question on the growth for the EAC region in 2020, I would say that we began by saying that globally growth projections are highly uncertain, but we do make assumptions regarding the disruption of activities, and the same assumptions also hold for the EAC, that largely activities will be disrupted, particularly in the first half of 2020 to contain the spread of COVID. And so we do provide the source of these projections. They are largely drawn from a standard model that put together all countries, and then we'll be able to see the average for the EAC. And based on that average, that's what we put there, and we provide the source of that projection. Thank you.
And then just very quickly on the final question around the payments to China and default risk. I mean, that's not something that we see as being in prospects. Kenya has a variety of sources of financing and an organized approach to its debt management. I also mentioned it's reasonable to expect more development partner engagement and kind of global resources coming in to assist countries really across the board. So that's what I would say on default risk. Payments to China, yeah, I mean, the bilateral debt that Kenya has is a significant component of the external debt. And so the servicing of that debt is a substantial portion of the debt service that Kenya has. So a suspension of bilateral debt would be beneficial for Kenya's liquidity in the near term. But as I also said, there are many considerations around that, and government will be developing its approach to that possibility accordingly.
Thank you, Alex and Peter. We have a few more questions here, and then we'll have to close our session for today. One participant is curious to understand the impact on the Kenya shilling in the medium term in light of the ongoing macroeconomic environment. And Dinesh wants to know if the local situation affects the fundamental view on agricultural performance over the short and medium term. Professor Onywere would like to says that since Saturday, the 18th of April, the country has experienced unprecedented rainfall that has led to intense and widespread flooding across the country, with significant damage to infrastructure, settlements, and farms. Does this then render the World Bank prediction for short-term growth invalid? And the third question here is, does the World Bank believe Kenya is under testing in terms of COVID-19? If yes, how much should Kenya be testing per 1,000 people, for example? Over to you.
Thank you very much. So on the shilling, that's not something that we forecast explicitly. But as we have said, an important part of, I think, our understanding of what's happening with COVID is that it's a big external shock. And whenever you have an external shock, it's actually a source of economic resilience if your currency can absorb and adjust to part of that shock. And clearly we've seen some of that in Kenya with the shilling. But we also need to see this in the context of really a global, flight to safety, as they call it, and a big increase in demand for the most liquid currency, which of course is the dollar. So we have to understand what's happening with the currency in that much wider and indeed global context.
Sure, okay. On the low cost, we have already responded to that question, so I will skip it. On flooding, yes, there's a likelihood that flooding could lead to destruction of infrastructures. This is a fair concern, but there is additional mitigation to be able to help deal with the effect that comes with flooding. This is not the first time that Kenya has been affected by floods. I think we have been fortunate to receive plenty of rains for both the short rains late last year, and the long rains have also come early on. Suddenly there will be a huge damage, particularly in terms of infrastructure, but it's not difficult to say that the government has ways to contain this particular destruction in terms of flooding. Now, on testing, COVID-19 testing, this is not an area that we have expertise in. We are not epidemiologists, but I would say that the statistics we are seeing is that Kenya has already been able to test up to about 18,000 people plus, and they've been doing a lot of contact tracing and quarantining contacts to be able to test them. So they are doing all the right things. And in terms of, globally, every country is struggling in terms of testing because this is what's really needed to be able to understand the epidemiology of the virus and to be able to respond with strategies to be able to reopen the economy. So what I would say is that at the moment, all countries are struggling with ramping up the capacity to test. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you both for an excellent presentation here today. I think we have all learned a lot, and we can take the conversation offline. We have a number of questions still coming in here at us. But right now, I would like to hand over to the World Bank Kenya's program leader, Mr. Alan Dennis, to make the closing remarks. And Alan, I wasn't going to let you get off easy. We have one quick question here for you. When are the World Bank COVID-19 support funds meant to be disbursed in Kenya? If you can answer that very briefly, 30 seconds, and then close, I'd be most grateful. Over to you, Alan.
Thank you, Vera. Very quickly on your last question, World Bank support to COVID has already started arriving in Kenya. We started right at the beginning and we are continuing. So it's coming in phases, but it's already ongoing. And we're very much committed to supporting the government and the people of Kenya in this fight against COVID. Now, my responsibility is to give just a few closing remarks here, and I really much enjoyed this conversation. So thank you, Peter and Alex, for a brilliant presentation, but also filled in very interesting questions. And as I look at it, I mean, clearly we're living in very trying times, unprecedented times, and we all have to contribute to be able to support efforts to contain the virus, but also to support the economy going forward. This is, as Peter rightly mentioned, this is a shock, an exogenous shock that is having huge impacts, not just on lives, but also on livelihoods. And 1.5% drop GDP growth means a lot to the ordinary person. The number may just be a number, but what it means is that the people are not earning either their daily wages. People cannot afford their rent. Some people may not even have food. So we're obviously living through very difficult challenges. And one wise person said that we should never let a crisis go to waste. And I'd like to just remind our listeners that, this is not the first crisis that has hit the Kenyan economy. And I've just taken a quick look through the history of Kenya's, growth. And there are several spots in times in the 70s during the oil crisis and the drop in coffee prices when the economy tanked to about 0.9%, and yet it grew back in the following year or two to about 22%. Similarly, we've seen similar shocks in the 80s. And of course, most recently, we saw a strong negative shock due to the post-election challenges of growth around 0.8% in 2008, and a recovery to the strongest growth rate of about 8.4% in 2010, not seen, for a very long time. So what am I saying? What I'm saying is that, let's think about ways to build back better as we go through this crisis, because as someone said, and this too shall pass. But when it passes, what is the Kenyan economy going to look like? So it is the measures that we're taking now that will help the economy to be able to build back better and hopefully have Kenya rise up like a phoenix from the ashes. And both Peter and Alex have very much given us some ideas. Alex says, I like the way Alex framed the issues. Let's think about measures to be able to flatten the human suffering. And the government is doing some work in this area, in the area of social safety nets. And I think that could be expanded. And more people that can come in to support that, I think, will be very good to help livelihoods, to flatten the human suffering curve. But of course, there is also suffering to firms, small and medium-sized firms. What can be done? The report does reflect the importance of liquidity support to firms. The report does reflect the importance of helping firms transition to maybe a digital economy, to digitization. So the report does have a lot of recommendations. And a lot of the questions that we've also received today also reflect on some ideas that can help us to navigate through these difficult times. So with those few words, I'd like to thank our listeners, and let's join together, be development partners, be the government, be the private sector, to help Kenya navigate through this crisis and to come out of it at the other end much stronger. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Team World Bank. This has been a very exciting presentation. To my fellow Kenyans, I would like to say, stay safe, stay home. If you're going outside, please use your mask, and please follow the containment guidelines as outlined by the government of Kenya. Let's do this. We are all in this together. Let's commercial Corona. Over to you, Julian, and thank you very much, NTV, for allowing us to broadcast the launch of the Kenya Economic Update Live. Over to you.
Much appreciated, Vera. That takes us to the close of business as far as the launch of the World Bank Kenya Economic Update Report for 2020 is concerned. Quite some great insights therein. I hope this conversation continues online. That is on Twitter, Facebook, and whichever other social media platforms. Let's keep the conversation going about how this economy can rebound from the present situation. Up next is NTV Sasa.